When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back. This is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode is titled... Actually, I'm going to read you the bad title first. I'm going to read you the bad title. This is the title I made because I started writing these in OneNote just because it's on my phone and my tablet and everywhere. So I started writing it there, and then I converted to a Google Doc later for everyone to consume. And my title that I had for this for a great number of hours, if not a few days, was Front-End Development Time Saved. It was quite literally the most like programmatic, like almost like a variable name in a way, name ever. And it's not a good title. So the title that we've decided to go with is Time-Saving Tips for Front-End Developers. That's courtesy of Mike. He came in and PR'd me. He came in and was like, Matt, you can't publish these words. They make no sense.
That's exactly how I said it, too. Like a friggin' 70s or 50s reporter.
Your story is appearing right above the part where it says, we won the war, in big, bold letters. I guess... So yeah, that's the story of front-end development time saved. But in this episode, if you haven't figured it out already, we're going to be talking about how to save time as a front-end developer. This is inspired by last week. I just had a bunch of projects on the go, a whole bunch of things on the go. And so I kind of pulled out all the stops and just did a bunch of little things that added up to me being able to finish everything within a good time. So we're going to be sharing those tips with you. Some of the stuff is reiterated from previous episodes. Other stuff's going to be maybe tied in with stories and stuff like that. So let's get this show on the road. Before we do that, if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go check us out on that Patreon. Leave a review or rating on your podcast app. Join us in our Discord server or share this with your friends. And remember that we also have a Scrimba affiliate link. If you want to, I'm going to take a breath here. Whew, laugh too much. If you want to go and learn how to code with their interactive media player code editor, go and learn from a whole bunch of different instructors. Some courses are free, some are not, etc. Go and check that out. Our affiliate link will be in the show description as well as on htmlallthethings.com in the show notes. So, without further ado, let me take you down memory lane to like 4 days ago, I think, approximately, which is not that long, when I was just rushing through a whole bunch of different projects just to get them done. And, you know, I wanted to kind of think about or talk about this sort of mantra, which is if you have like a project that, let's say, doesn't have a deadline, you just have this project that's in front of you and you say, you know, the best way to make this project, develop this project, do this project, it doesn't even have to be coding related. The best way to do this is going to be to take your time, you know, do it properly. You know, stitch and time saves 9 is what the old, I don't know, metaphor is, I suppose, right? So on paper, if we bring that into the sort of web development space, it may seem that the best way to develop websites is to take your time and do it properly. Now, I'm not saying that that's a bad way to do it, certainly not. But with that sort of phrase in mind, it may seem that developing slowly and as perfectly as possible would be the best approach, right? Go as slow as possible. Make sure you cover every single inch of everything. Make sure everything's as perfect as possible. Now, this method may result in a highly polished product. It may do that. And some people live and die by the method that I just said. Some people, you know, have a project that has to be extremely polished by the end. It has to be perfect. And so, fair enough. However, many projects do not have the absence of a deadline. Many projects do have a deadline, or at least a deadline based upon another deadline. So maybe your personal project, you really want to get this blog post done. There's no hard deadline on it. It's your personal project, but you do have some other work that's coming up that does have a deadline. So now your first thing, your blog post kind of does have a deadline, right? So the time investment for these highly polished products is just really, really high. And so the development process and the time invested, you know, is just so strenuous and so like specific that it doesn't play well with sort of the modern feedback system. So oftentimes if you're developing a site, you'll do something like you make a navbar, you'll make a heading, you'll make a whatever it is, a call to action. And then somebody, typically your client or even yourself, will go into the designs, go into the work, and not only find and squash bugs or tell you what bugs to squash, but they'll also look at it and say, hey, this heading could need more spacing. This heading's supposed to be red. This one's supposed to be purple. This content needs to change, those type of things. And if you've spent like just a really egregious amount of time and development effort making this thing perfect, how much more time is it going to be to ensure that these changes are now made to a system that's airtight, that's like super perfect, and now you're going to have to go in and modify it and then presumably retest everything to ensure that all that other stuff is perfect as well. So in my last episode, meaning the one that I did, we explored ways, I think it might be 2 back now, I can't remember, but anyway, we explored ways to develop websites quickly. And the way I handled that was not the same way that I'm talking about in this episode. In the last episode, we talked about, hey, you have a project in front of you, how do you get a website done quickly? And we talked about how to do that with custom code, with no-code platforms, and even if you want to pull double duty, where you're working on the content and then you also hire a web dev agency to get the job done. So that's how that sort of episode went. And in this episode, I want to talk about, let's say you've decided that you yourself are going to start custom coding your own UI. How do we save time in there without sort of rushing through? It's sort of the slow is smooth and smooth is fast is basically what I'm going to be talking about in this episode in general. And I do want to say that I picked up a lot of these tips and tricks along the way from custom coding websites in vanilla, even with a couple of Vue projects that Mike and I worked on back in the day. So custom code there as well. And also on Webflow as well. So if you're a Webflow user, you can use these tips as well because they absolutely work. In most cases, of course. So this very first thing I'm going to say is to make notes in your CSS classes. Now, this might sound like a sin or maybe confusing to some people out there. What do you mean by notes? Like, I'm not going to make my class, hey, Matt, make sure this text is blue, dash heading or something like that. No one's going to want you to write a class like that, right? That type of stuff should be left for comments, if at all, realistically, in the code. But what I mean by it is I want to make my classes glanceable. And when I say that, I also want to make my work area not glanceable, but safe. So let's say you have an existing class. This website's already done to some extent. There's a class just straight up, very common, called content-box. Really easy. And you want to make a new content box that is similar, but it is not 100% the same. Now you can add another class, right? You can have multiple classes on the same element. So maybe you want to have the content-box class and then follow it immediately by the new class. You could do that, absolutely. But if the content box class, content-box class, if it starts to be manipulated in a way that isn't, say, controlled or handled by the new class, you're going to start having some problems, right? Now, this is a normal way to do it. Like having content-box with a new is a totally, fair way to do things. I do it all the time. In Webflow, they're called combo classes. In vanilla code, I just personally call it multiple classes on an element. I'm sure there's a way to call it. I think it might be called stacked classes or something like that. But that's not what I'm talking about here. The content box and the new class together is not a very glanceable way of doing something. So let's say I really need to make this quickly, and I don't want to affect the original content-box class. What I would do is I'd copy the entire class with all of its properties, and I would add a quote-unquote note at the beginning of it. So what I'm doing is I'm adding to the name. So I'm literally putting something like, say, new-content-box. That's the name of my new class. Something right at the beginning of the class where I know it's something for me, right? It's something that I know this is the new one. And hopefully for you, it'll be something more descriptive. Like just for the sake of an audio show, me saying new makes sense. But for you, you might put, call to action, or you might put birthday if it's the birthday of website, or you might put Christmas, or you might put Halloween or something like that, right? Or pumpkin if it's Halloween or Thanksgiving or something like that. Something glanceable where you know that this content box is meant for Halloween or a birthday or whatever it is. Now, the idea is that now your content box will look the same, right? So now you've copied over all the properties and everything of the original content-box class, but you've renamed it to this new content box class. And now you have free reign over changing all the properties. Go in there, break it entirely, delete it all, change it, do whatever. And if everything gets too messed up, you can always go back and recopy the properties and their settings from the original content-box class. This saves you from accidentally ruining other content boxes throughout the design. This gives you complete isolation. And in the future, if you're like, you know what, my content box is virtually the same, or maybe it is the same, you can always just go in and refactor and switch it back to just content-box if you need to. But by having this sort of duplicated class with a bit of a note at the beginning of the class name, it gives you that glanceability. You can work fast, and you know that you're the one doing it. A common one that Mike and I actually do in a lot of our work, or at least I do, is I'll put a comment on something. So if I'm working on, let's say, a Webflow site, and I need to put a bit of CSS, I will commonly put a comment that says DDD, which is Digital Dynasty Design, which is the name of our agency. So I'll quickly put a DDD in there as the comment, and I know that anything within the DDD comments is something that we've added. So if the client comes at me and says, hey, ever since you were in there, this broke, I literally can just comment out our entire section of CSS, and then if it's still broken, I'd be like, hey, actually it wasn't. This was broken the whole time. So just making sort of notes and making your CSS classes sort of safe, isolated, which we'll talk about later as well, isolation, but also just making it glanceable and quick and sort of free form to work on, to me, saves me a lot of time.
I think another kind of tip that I do with CSS classes, or even just like screwing around with like the temporary CSS, I do a lot of my screwing around inside of DevTools. So a lot of times if I need to just quickly try to change a class or change a little container or content box, I'll just open up DevTools and do a lot of the changes in there. Keeping track of them is a little bit hectic, but I'll usually limit it to focusing on one thing at a time, and I'll change that if I need to kind of prototype something quickly. And that, again, it's kind of the same thing where it's isolated away from your code. No matter what you do, you can always hit the refresh button, get back to exactly where you were. It's just an easy way to really do quick testing and iteration for me. A lot of times, essentially my process is quickly put up a bunch of HTML that I can play with, put what I think is the right Tailwind classes. For my case, I work a lot with Tailwind, but same thing. Put a lot of Tailwind classes on my HTML that I think is going to work, and then I'll save it, look at the actual site. Then a lot of times to refine, I'll do the refinements in the DevTools. And then I'll copy over those refinements as Tailwind classes back into my code. And that iteration process works pretty well for me. Sometimes I'll do a little bit of refinement with the Tailwind as well. But I like that sandbox environment, kind of like what you're talking about, where you're just allowed to do whatever the heck you want, test out different things really quickly. The DevTools has a lot of really good autocomplete where you start typing in and it'll list all the options for Flex and everything. You just click down. It'll in real time show you what every single thing looks like. So I take advantage of that a lot.
The autocomplete, like you're saying, and the drop downs that are in the DevTools are really nice too, because you'll sometimes forget, or it'll give you an idea even where you're like, you know what, maybe a span would work here, right? Or maybe a display block would work here, or maybe I shouldn't be using padding. I should be using margin here. And you can play without it literally changing anything but what's on your screen. It's not changing the code base at all. And then go in and, actually change it. And even with, obviously with custom coded sites, I will absolutely use the DevTools as well. But with WordPress site, WordPress as well, actually. But for Webflow sites, I'll do the same thing, where I'll, have it published if I'm allowed to publish, and I'll go into the published page and be like, oh shoot, that should be a little over. Okay, that's a little bit to the left, or whatever, and kind of go through and fix things like that. Or just play with it, where I'll let's say I have 5 elements, I'll throw all 5 elements in the section that I need, and then I'll play with how I want to do it. I'm not sure if I want to do flex or grid here yet, so I don't want to start having a whole bunch of classes all over the place yet. I don't want to have to start messing with all that stuff. So why don't I just mess with it locally, kind of get an idea and go yep, you know what, grid gets it about 70% of the way there, let's do that. Flex maybe does this time, I'll do it that way. DevTools is really invaluable, for this type of stuff, absolutely. There's something else here that some people will try to do, and I struggle with this as well. I'm sure many other people do too. And it's preservation. What I mean by that is, let's say you're working on a site, it already exists, and you have something done. Doesn't matter what it is. Let's just say it's a call to action. That's very common. You have a call to action, and the call to action is already completed. It's already coded up, it connects to the whatever marketing software you have to collect email or phone number or whatever it is that the people are typing in, their name, etc. And so you're tasked to change the style of it. And fair enough. But then you spend so much time working around the code that already exists because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. And not reinventing the wheel, this is a bit of a tug of war. Not reinventing the wheel and constantly redoing things is absolutely a part of the whole kind of mantra of like work smarter, not harder, and therefore will save you time. But sometimes you can spend too much time trying to preserve what's there. Oh, I really don't want to touch this, this nav bar. I really don't want to touch this call to action. I'm going to like keep working around it, tweaking it, and then constantly trying to get it to work. Sometimes you're even kind of like hacking things together, and it gets really messy. So what I'm saying is sometimes preservation of things like that, trying not to reinvent the wheel, is actually overrated. And sometimes it just makes sense to start over. Especially if you kind of have the idea of how you would have built it from the beginning in your head and you think it'd be fast. Sometimes that's the way to go. And it's difficult to judge when that is. So I have a couple of examples here of times in which modifying existing sort of areas on a site, existing elements, when they were really difficult. And when I start getting into the weeds like this, then I start saying, I might just rebuild this and make it look the same or make it look similar. So the first one here is strictly laid out sections. For me, if something is really CSS grid heavy, I don't know CSS grid amazingly. I know it okay. I don't use it too much. I much prefer Flexbox, but I will use CSS grid in certain instances. And this is, again, totally personal preference. That's kind of where I see CSS grid as sort of living. In very particular circumstance, when you need a very specific design that's really hard to control with Flexbox. But if it's controllable with Flexbox, then I would prefer that. And what I find is if you are into somebody else's CSS grid and you're trying to manipulate it to do something else, you're trying to change the look of it or whatever, I find it to be really difficult. Now, again, it might be because of my lack of experience with grid versus Flexbox. That's totally fair. But once things get really gritty, if you will, I started just okay, I'm out of here. Just last week, I was working on a section of a site. It was all gridded out. I messed with it for about 30 minutes. I said, you know what? I think I could do this with Flexbox. I literally didn't even delete it. I just created a new section, so it looked kind of dumb. I had two of the same section. And I recreated their section, and then I added, the new changes that I needed to do. And I did that faster than the 30 minutes. Said, okay, deleted the old one, and there's the new one. That was a CSS grid heavy thing that I just said, you know what, the heck with this, I'm out of here. I lend CSS grid, again, this might be just my personal experience, but I lend CSS grid to complex CSS structure. And that's my next point that I want to mention is when something is really complex CSS structure, sometimes it's time to just back away. Now, like I said, CSS grid's part of this, but another big thing of this is actually class naming standards. Maybe someone has gone in and used BEM to the nth degree. Maybe someone has used, I'm just going to call them combo classes because that's what Webflow calls it, which is multiple classes on an element, to be clear. But maybe there's multiple combo classes. Like it's like content box, left, right, italic, three, it's so many classes. And then sure, I could add my own class to the end of it and then mess with it. And I could absolutely do that. But then, we're starting to get 8 classes on an element here. And it's sort of at what point do we just want to have another class? And, some of this stuff can be controversial depending on your own organization and stuff. But if you're trying to move quickly, dealing with a complex CSS naming standard, or even one that's very established that you're unfamiliar with, it is difficult to use, and that's going to slow you down. And also, if you are coming in to work with it, should the existing sort of complexity be disturbed? You don't know the implications of disturbing that sometimes. Sometimes it's obvious where it's just a footer class and it's kind of complexly laid out. And if you mess with it, it's going to affect, I would hope just the footer everywhere on the site. But, maybe it's worth just having, a footer dash new class or a new dash footer class and just working to your heart's content really quickly at it. And then you realize okay, mine's better or maybe theirs is better. And just in the interest of time, kind of experimenting in that way. Because a complex CSS structure, especially when the names start getting really complex and you weren't the one there to do it, can get really, really messy. Also, sometimes you need to work in a live production environment. It's never amazing, but sometimes you have to do that. Maybe you're going in and doing a quick repair or something like that. And so as a result, you really don't have the option, or maybe realistically, you shouldn't be changing existing CSS classes because they're being used where? So like a tool like Webflow will tell you, hey, this is being used here, and it's also being used in 10 other places. But if you're just in a regular sort of vanilla project, let's say HTML, CSS only, you don't know where that CSS class is being used. There's nothing saying this is being used in 14 areas. It's not saying if it's just being used on the homepage. So you really don't have the option to change existing classes. And so there's no real reason to be preserving when you're in that production environment. You're tiptoeing too much. Realistically, what I will normally do is I'll either, in a production environment specifically, I'll add another combo class. I'll add another class to it. Call it, whatever it is, like new or changed or whatever, something that's descriptive to what I'm doing. And then somebody can either, add or remove that class as needed to get the old or the new styles. And it's just a quick way to sort of fix it in production. It's like a little bit of surgery and then you kind of like come out. Also, this is, again, kind of really tied to that complex CSS layout, the kind of like a strictly laid out section as well. When you want a specific manipulation and you're working with an existing sort of strict or complex layout, sometimes you'll start hacking. You'll start using padding instead of margin. You'll start using margin instead of padding, and the list goes on. You'll use gap, but then the gap doesn't work because this thing is over to the left, but that one's absolutely set, and like it's all over the place. And so it's like you start getting this web of like, okay, I got to set that to relative, but this one's absolute according to this, so now that's broken, so I got to move that margin around, and it starts getting really, really messy. At this point, preservation's overrated. Sometimes you're just better to restart or like copy everything, make it all like a new class, and then start tearing into it because you don't want to like rip apart everything that exists there already. And I've already mentioned this in passing, but I just want to touch on it now, and that is too many or too complex combo classes. That is multiple classes on an element. I know the websites are like it's totally valid HTML, it's totally valid CSS to have multiple classes, and I absolutely use it myself, no doubt. A great example might be content box, and then you add like a St. Paddy's Day as a second class to make those content boxes green on a certain day. That's a totally great way to do that. And obviously combo classes can go much further than that. However, again, you start getting into these systems that are really locked down, really strict, really, really bloated, and have like 5, 6, 7, complex combo classes. And then the only way for you to fix it is to add another combo class, start adding importance onto things. It starts becoming too much of a mess. It's too many and it's too complex. Then I start over and I say, okay, preservation's overrated here. I need to start over. I need to like build it my way. Hopefully in a, not a cheaper way, but in a more efficient way, I suppose.
I think this is a big one for me as well. Just not even only from a front end sense, but a project sense. I believe I was talking to someone that worked at a fairly large company recently that said that they kind of have a policy where they rebuild every 3 years. They rebuild their products every 3 years. There's a lot of reasons for doing that. Obviously, it's expensive. Obviously, it's time intensive. But the reality is that whenever you build something, the first time you build it, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to build it pretty hacky. You're going to do it in technology that you're either too familiar with or not familiar with, whatever. Like, it's going to be a first attempt, and it's going to be very clearly a first attempt. Especially having to do the iteration of design adjustments along the way. A lot of times that's what leads to what Matt's saying with like, there's a lot of hackiness in there because this designer came in and wanted it this way. This designer came in and wanted it this way. That leads to hackiness. Like there's just no way around it. You're just trying to get something kind of going, and that's going to be the product at the end of the day. So the first rebuild usually happens because you've learned the systems, you've learned how to do it better, you've done a couple pages in a really good way that you really like, and you're like, screw it, I want to get all the other pages aligned to these pages that are like the golden standard, right? So that's an indication that like you don't want to preserve, like you want to just rebuild it in a better way, in a more cognitive way, in a way that's better, that's easier to maintain, etc., etc., etc. Everything that Matt said. And then every 3 years, that might be a little bit too much. But the reality is that as you progress as a developer, as you progress as a team, as you work better together, you'll find that every certain amount of time, you'll get that like, hey, these pages are the ones that are the best. So no matter how good you thought those pages were 3 years ago, you're going to get better. And it's going to get more cohesive. You're going to start to synergize with the team better. And it's just going to become a better product that you're creating. And you're going to be like, you know what? These pages are so good that it doesn't make sense to keep maintaining these other ones. We should rewrite it again to continue to improve our skills ourselves, to continue to improve the code base, and to make it easily extensible for future iterations and stuff like that. And it just becomes a cycle. And I think it's a very good cycle of becoming better as a developer, becoming better as a team, and generating better code bases, more maintainable code bases as you go. Now, yes, it's expensive. Yes, it's time consuming to do that. But if you're really working on a product that you see, and there's no time frame for it to be over because you continually have to add features to it, which is what a lot of products are these days. Like a lot of SaaS products, a lot of internal dashboards and stuff like that, they're continually evolving pieces of software. The longer you wait to rebuild and the longer you kind of add on these hacky classes on top of things and hacky functions, the worse it's going to become, period. There is no way to really make it so that you have a perfect system in place from the very beginning that will always be maintained as a perfect system without refactoring, without taking this time to kind of go back and figure out what can be rewritten or what should be rewritten. So I think this one is something that you should consider. I lean a lot towards doing this. I have bit myself in the foot by not doing it before. That's why I like this method. A previous project that I worked on, I came into a code base that was worked on by 2 or 3 different teams, and it was a mess. Like, there was just so many things written that shouldn't have been written the way, and we tried to do a lot of things in place without actually rewriting, and at the end of the day, most of that was a mistake. We went down rabbit holes that we shouldn't have went down, and if we had rewritten the entire thing from scratch, it would have probably taken us a quarter of the time that it took to maintain it.
You know, like, your comments ring true in my head about on the gaming side of things, because if you're a gamer listening to this, and like I know, Mike, you are, like, the Bethesda engine is constantly under fire, right? Bethesda is an example of a company that's kept the same engine for, I believe it's like decades at this point. It's got like some weird problems that are like clearly deeply rooted that maybe a Band-Aid would fix, but then somebody else would do something that relies on that broken thing that they weren't aware was broken because it's a bug in the engine. You know, the list goes on, and it reminds me of when Fallout 76 came out. I'm just going to briefly describe it because I know not everyone here is a gamer, but Fallout 76 is the very first massively multiplayer online, or a shared world as some people call it, Fallout game. And it came out, it was a freaking disaster. The engine was a mess and everything. And there was a discussion, like, at length at E3 back in the day. I believe it was E3 Coliseum with Jeff Keighley, if you want to look it up. And I'm doing this from memory, so some of this might be incorrect, but I remember one of the people there was talking about trying to get the engine to work. And they said one of the problems is that the engine was, first of all, it's aged. Like, it's aged, it's old, right? It's a seasoned thing that many people are saying, Bethesda, please throw this out and restart, right? And basically, this guy was saying how the game is designed around a single player, like a single person. And that person, I believe they called Atlas. And so everything would happen according to Atlas. Like, Atlas walked into town equals start event, you know. Oh, like, start event, random chance of this event. I remember he had this description of they finally got the client server working, but they couldn't figure out how to remove Atlas. Like, Atlas was so deeply ingrained in this engine. Of course, it was designed around Atlas, right? Designed around a single player. Where they had just an NPC, just like a generic NPC called Atlas in the middle of an area. And they were running around playing the game in multiplayer, but Atlas had to exist in this area in order for the area around Atlas to load. And so they were running around and playing the game, but it was still relying on Atlas. And I remember him saying, kind of as a closing comment to this, was that he went into the code on several occasions, and on one occasion he found a Daggerfall fix. And if you don't know what Daggerfall is the Elder Scrolls 2. To put that into perspective, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion came out in 2006. Elder Scrolls 2 is 2 back. I believe Elder Scrolls 3 was 2002. And the Elder Scrolls Daggerfall is the 90s at some point, I believe. So we're talking about, somebody had a problem in Daggerfall, wrote that code to fix it in Daggerfall, and it existed to this day. I understand game engines can be arguably more complex than web in some cases. I'm not going to get into that argument today. I know that some people are going to say web is harder, this is harder. I'm not in an argument of who's doing a more difficult job. I really don't care. My point is that web suffers from the same problem, where I'm not going to find a Daggerfall fix because the website at one point wasn't called Daggerfall. But I might find something that's like WordPress 2.0 fix if the website's super old and I wrote a random piece of code to fix a WordPress 2.0 problem, and I've never done a full refresh, or I've never done any cleanup or any in-depth maintenance. And even if I have done maintenance and have spent that time doing that, that stuff can be missed. You know, you can miss that random fix that someone put in there, and that's tech. That's technical debt. That's a lot of technical debt. Mike and I talked about that at length, I don't know, a year or so ago, where we talked about, you know, the implications of it and what it can cause and all that kind of thing. And that's absolutely like something that can happen here again, where like technical debt can just really add up. And this is an example of this is an example of that potentially happening, and is seemingly, although I don't have any specific insight, but seemingly happening to a like world-renowned developer making, you know, large experiences that millions of people play. So this is something that can affect everybody. Like,
can I just say that having heard you explain all that, I knew about it, but then I kind of put something together now. Microsoft recently bought Bethesda, and they have the exact same ethos with their software. They don't rebuild. They don't rewrite. There's Windows 95 code in Windows 11. They don't rewrite. Maybe they were like, I like the way you guys think. I like the cut of your jib.
Maybe.
You guys don't rewrite. They met the perfect match. It's unfortunate because, like, again, Microsoft suffers from the same thing with Windows, where it's just like people consider it to be a pretty janky mess a lot of times because they're opening up settings menus that are completely separate from the actual platform that they're on. Like, they'll open up like a Windows 11 setting and all of a sudden open up in an old control panel, and then that'll all of a sudden open up a dialog box from Windows 95. It's like, what's going on here?
Yeah, why is this in here? Yeah.
Why is this in here? And the reason it's in here is because they didn't follow this advice that preservation is sometimes overrated. At some point, they should have been like, no, let's just rebuild. Having said that, I do want to point out, like Matt mentioned it, but building a web tech, and not all web tech, like Figma is a crazy piece of software that's on the web, but most of the time is not the same as building a game engine and an operating system. I don't think I'm going to anger anyone by saying that. I think that's a pretty known thing. So, like, yeah, I get it to a certain degree, but, like, I also don't get it because you're a multi-billion-dollar company or trillion, whatever they are right now. Like, get a team to rewrite Windows from scratch, please. It's not that much of an ask, honestly, from the perspective of the fact that they have infinite money.
Yeah, they could literally spin up another team, like 100 people, and just be like, yo, chip away at this for a while, so that at the very least, even if like Windows 13 is out and they finally finish, we're not pulling in Windows 95 stuff, we're pulling in Windows 11 stuff.
Correct.
In the interest of time, they're always going to be struggling with that. Although, like, I do, now they say that, I've been watching videos on like people that modify Windows and stuff, and like a lot of them are saying like Windows 11 is an absolute atrocity, although that might, a lot of it is, some people are mad, but some people are just trying to get, you know, YouTube clicks. But a lot of people will say it's not a very good desktop operating system for a bunch of different reasons. They're like, you know, obviously like the interface is not as like quick as it once was, and blah, blah, blah. And like the old school way is better. But I did find a video that was describing how there's like a tool. I can't even remember exactly what it was for because I've never used this piece of tech, but it's a dialer for like specifically like a fax machine in a certain context or something. It's in Windows. It's on Windows 11, and it's from Windows 95. And the thing is like, the guy raised a good point. He's like, who's going to rewrite this? And why would you? At the same time, someone's going to plug in that fax machine and be like, why the hell doesn't this work? Like, why the hell doesn't this 20 to 30-year-old fax machine work? It's worked all this time. Why doesn't it work today?
And to that person, I would say... use an older operating system. Like, I just think they have to like cut it off at some point, because I've heard that argument before a million times. I get it to a certain degree, especially because like security wise, but like for Christ's sake, like, it's a 30-year-old fax machine. Please, for the love of God, open up a Windows 95 installation, don't connect it to the internet, and like just use the stupid fax machine if you really need that. So like, it's just, I don't know. I'm getting argument, tired right? of that. Yeah. Like, I'm getting tired of that argument.
We've had arguments with clients. Well, like Michael will attest to this, where we've been given laptops that are like 25 years old, and they're like, well, can you do anything with this? And I'm like for me to use? And they're like, well, no, it's kind of like slow in that. I'll be like, I'd imagine this 30-year-old machine on its original hard drive, you know, which is well past its expiration date, is going to be in a bit of a old man shape, if you will. At what point, when do we stop taping things together? And that's me saying that. Mike knows that I tape shit together for years. Like, I got a 35-year-old couch situation here. Like, I just do not care. Like, I'll just keep taping things together until they can't be taped together anymore. But like, there does come a point where I go like, okay, that's it. Like, this is getting out of here type thing. But there's some people that just will not. In fact, Mike, I do actually have a potential fax machine situation coming up from one of our clients. And actually, no, I do have one. And I might just give them your number.
I promise you I will not answer.
Oh, hey, this is our fax expert. Though you can pick up, since you're the fax expert, they can only fax you. But I'll say it's a phone number, and you can just make the fax machine noise when you accidentally call a fax machine. Like all the beeps and boops and... Oh.
Hello?
Hello? Actually, I'd like to take one brief moment. How many people have we called that have been actively drilling into their telephone when we picked up the phone?
Yeah, it has been a significant amount in our days of calling people. Thankfully, I think that's what taught me not to call people anymore. Just because, like, no one can be bothered to answer the phone in a respectful way anyway. So, like, why do I bother calling them? Just email. Jump on a call if you need to on like a Slack or something like that, or like a Zoom call. I'm not calling anyone. Like, very rarely have I had a call where I called someone, like cold called or called them without them knowing I'm going to call them, and had it gone like in a good way. It's usually like, what do you want? Because they're thinking it's a scam caller or something, which is fair. Like, that's what I think. If I get a random call from a random number, like, yeah, it's the hell do you want?
The thing I love about it is, like, I think you and I had the conversation of like, I wanted to buy a cap gun. So whenever I pick up the phone, I could just fire off like a cap gun over and over again. Hello? What's going on over there? The lesson here is Mike's not going to call you, but if I call you, because I do call people, please keep your drills and your sandblasters at home, or at least away from the phone. And Mike, you're going to get a call from a fax person. Anyway, the next thing here about saving time is work now and refactor later. So Mike and I have talked about this in the past. I'm not going to spend a copious amount of time on this, but when you're under the demands of like a high-speed development job, like you just need to get something done, you may have no choice but to work quick enough just to get the job done. And you don't have any time to worry about what the code looks like, how it's commented, or how efficient it is, within reason, of course. If it's going to take down the site or use 700% of the CPU, I mean, that's different. But, within reason, of course. And the idea behind working quick like this is that you work fast to get it functioning, and then you spend less time than it took to get it functioning refactoring it later to tune it up, add the comments, get rid of things that are redundant, fix typos, those type of things. The benefits of doing this is, of course, you get your work done quickly, like I said, but also from sort of an office perspective, you get your feedback faster. You give it to somebody, they give you feedback. The faster you give it to them, and chances are the faster you'll get the feedback back. And also you can make changes kind of quicker. So you aren't worried about how it looks and how it works yet. You haven't done that sort of perfect program like I mentioned in the beginning of the episode. So you can go in and things are already sort of, kind of MacGyvered together. So you can just throw another MacGyver into the mix and kind of get things running. Now, the downfall of this is that refactoring itself can actually introduce new bugs, especially since you worked quickly. Refactoring can introduce new bugs based on what you've done in the refactoring, but also your thing may have been on kind of like a leaning tower of Pisa. It could have been barely hanging on, and any little touch, even if it's not a mistake, could, add new bugs, cause things to crash, cause things to become problematic. This one bothers me a lot, and it's something I just have come to terms with, but it really bugs me, and that is that it is easy to miss things when you refactor. Because, you're just going back to do a quick tune-up. You're not going to go back and check every component of the website. You're just going to, run it a few times, go through, and you're going to remember, I have a weird loop here. I'm going to go change that. Oh, I have a weird class name here. Oh, my class name is hello, when it's actually the goodbye text. I better call it goodbye. Silly things like that. It's easy to miss those things. And I get that programs are imperfect, but this part is always why I don't necessarily like work now, refactor later, but it's something I have had to come to terms with. And basically the reality sort of behind this is that work now, refactor later is a necessary evil to deliver solutions quickly if you need to. And then hopefully whomever you're working for will give you time to still refactor, tune up, and sort of strive toward that perfection. I understand that perfection's, it's like an asymptote. You can always approach it but never actually reach it, etc., whatever. But the whole thing is that this method is a way to get things done very quickly. Just make sure you refactor and go back and try to clean things up as much as you can.
So interestingly, I actually have an episode idea that takes this into account called factor in refactoring. Yeah, so like factor in the fact that you have to refactor later, because I 100% agree with this. Like, the reality is a lot of times you need to build fast, and sometimes you'll go down the rabbit hole of being like, okay, I can write this perfectly right now, but it might take me a ton of time and we might not even use this feature. Or I can get this done and refactor this later, because like I said earlier in the last point, rewriting is something that you should factor in. Like, whatever you've written the first pass at, it will need a refactor. Even if it's just a minor one, even if it's a large one. But at the company I'm working at right now, we have refactor sprints where we just have like a week or two after we do a bunch of feature additions that we come back and we refactor. We factor in the fact that we're going to be building quickly and we're going to make mistakes. And that's okay, because we need to get these features out. We need to test them out. We need to like figure out if we even want them. And if we do, then we refactor.
It sounds like that's the responsible way to handle it, right? Because otherwise I guess I'll ask you this. So like, let's just say hypothetically your build out, like your original build out is a week, and then you factor in, let's just say a week, and maybe that's the wrong proportion, but a week for refactoring. Would you say that if you tried to, in the first pass without a refactor window, I think you would probably spend more than 2 weeks?
It's possible. Like, it really depends on what it is, but it's very possible that I'd spend more than 2 weeks trying to build it out, quote unquote, perfectly. But the other problem is that, like, until you've done something one way or incorrectly sometimes, whatever, you might not even know the right refactor or the right way to do it. So you could spend 2 weeks building it, but it might still need to be refactored, if that makes sense. Like, you can spend that extra week thinking that you're doing it perfectly, but because you haven't done it before, if it's something you haven't done before, that's in a special thing, especially like asterisk thing that you should put down and being like, I'm going to need to refactor this because I'm probably going to screw up the first time I do it. I'm going to get it working. I'm an engineer. I know how to do this shit, but there's probably a better way to do it than I'm doing it, regardless of what I think. So get it out, get it done like in a secure, good way, whatever. But because it's something you haven't done before, make sure that you factor in refactoring.
That is a really good point, because I mentioned in that sort of perfectionist, right at the beginning of the episode, sort of the go slow, do it as perfect as possible. It doesn't lend itself really well to feedback, right? And if you haven't done something before, or even if you have done it before, but let's say the design or the UX or the idea, something that you don't control, you're handed all this as a developer. Let's say you don't get involved in that stuff at all. The administration team does that. And their iteration 1, like their ideas and their thoughts were Gen 1, right? Then they have new ideas. Hey, why don't we have this be green? Why don't we flip it on top of its head? Why don't we animate the whole thing? Now your quote unquote perfect thing of code, which you may have only done once, like you said, is not going to be as perfect as you think. But now it also doesn't lend itself to having feedback. And now the feedback's going to be rushed because you took so long trying to do it perfectly in the beginning. So it's almost like, it really does drive home the idea that work now, refactor later is like a necessity. I think we should really, I'll stop talking about it now, but I feel like we really should dive into that in that episode you mentioned, because I think there's actually a lot to talk about and a lot to unpack there. So the next thing here, and these are slowly but surely getting less, so don't worry, I'm not going to talk for another 4 hours or anything. Next thing I want to talk about is isolating your work. So if you're still waiting for final approvals, and let's say somebody tells you hey, I really want you to change the contact form. But let's say the contact form is just, totally mission critical. It's how they get a lot of their leads, that type of thing. And they're like, let me just go talk to the manager. I'll be right back. And it's been 2 days. And you're like, well, my deadline's in 2 days. I don't know what to do here. I like to take a bit of initiative here. And what I'll do is I'll duplicate that page, and instead of it being contact us, it'll be, under a password. It'll be like dev/contact us or dev-contact us, whatever. And it'll be a private environment. And I'll go in and then I'll change the contact form and I'll mess with that type of thing. One thing this does is that it allows me to move forward, which is great for, working in a quick environment, but it also mitigates me having to tiptoe around the fact that I'm changing a page that's in production, especially if it's mission critical. This is much less stressful. It also gives people examples. So maybe that your manager went to talk to the director and the director was supposed to get back to them, but the director didn't get back to them not because they're busy, but because they're still thinking about it. Well, you making this little dev page may just jog their memory. You just, you send it to your manager and say, hey, I know we've been waiting for this, whatever, but I built this sort of concept. Is this what we're looking for? And then that might be the driving force to say, okay, let's get all of us, manager, director, and yourself into a call. Let's have a phone call. Let's take a look. Okay, you know what? We don't want the phone number there. We want the phone number formatted like that. Oh, we don't need country codes because we only accept phone numbers from Canada. So things like that, right? Things that are going to get fleshed out in a phone call from a Gen 1 idea, moving into like a Gen 2 more solidified idea. So it not only, sort of technically allows you to not tiptoe as much, but it also sort of office-wise alleviates that pressure, because if the person does come back to you and it's like, oh my God, we need this by the end of the day, it's like, hey, cool, I'm literally going to copy and then paste. I'm not like, oh my God, I got to start. Like having the anxiety of having to start rapidly is a really big one. Whereas just having something already done and just copying and pasting it over is much, 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 much better. Now, also in an isolated environment, you can work really, really quickly without the public seeing the work in progress. Now, what do I mean by that? So sometimes somebody will be on the fence, like I said, and they'll say, you know what, let's make the change. So like your manager does get feedback from the director and they say, add a country code to the phone number in this contact form. Cool. This is an experiment, really. So you go in, you do it. Okay, cool. Then, the public sees that and they have to interact with that. Let's say that UX hasn't really been thought out. It's Gen 1. Well, now the public's experiencing it. It's a little bit worse UX. And in this case, I know it's not the biggest deal, but obviously other UX problems can be bigger deals than this. And then they start thinking like, okay, like the public's suffering from this. Okay, can you rapidly change that really quick? Change it back? Like, oh shoot, you go to change it back. Now you're at risk of A, making a mistake, B, something might go wrong, whatever, things like that. Whereas it's better to have those conversations and those experiments, hopefully in the intranet, right? You three are working on this. Go send it to Mike. Go send it to someone else in the company. Go send it to somebody else. Get some feedback on it internally, in an environment where it doesn't have to affect the public. Get those experiments out, and then you're shipping, let's say, version 1.5 almost, let's say, in terms of design and layout. You're shipping version 1.5 instead of version, 0.2, and everyone's freaking out. Try to make the public suffer the least. So these isolated environments are great for a whole bunch of different things like that.
This one's a little bit weird because the typical standard procedure for any development work is always do everything in a dev environment and then shift it over to production. But I have seen in more and more places and more people I talk to where people just fucking push changes to prod or push changes to like they only have one database, just a production database, or they only have one like environment, which is just a production environment. It sounds bonkers, and I think a lot of people might say, like, oh, that probably doesn't happen. And in fact, I've even posted on Twitter about this once, and I got attacked saying that no one has an environment like that. It's not like people do. 100,000% people do in large corporations and large companies. People have environments where they don't have a dev environment. People have environments where they don't have a local environment to set up. Like, they just push to prod. I know, Matt, you're more specifically talking about, like, no-code Webflow tools, WordPress, stuff like that. But, like, this applies directly to any sort of like custom code as well, where as best you can do, you should always isolate your work, always get it into a spot where you can screw up. Like one of the big things I say to teams is like, you have to allow developers to make mistakes. If you make it an environment where any action can influence the company's bottom line while they're testing stuff, which is like, deploying to production, that's creating a really toxic environment for someone to learn, because now they're only doing the safest things. They're only following the safest principles. Like, yeah, that's a good thing, but like, think about feature building and doing things quickly. Like, that's not going to happen for you. You're only going to get stuff done because this thing has been done a million times and that's it. Like, no one's going to risk their neck to put a new feature or a new, calendar feature or something on your site when every time they put something there, it could take down your site, which could cause X amount of dollars, whatever. You're making a bad environment for innovation and development and growth on your developer team if you do that.
And what's kind of crazy? Like, I know, like, I'm coming, like, especially this point is coming from an idea of, like, a lot of people that work in something like WordPress or in something like Webflow will oftentimes be very close to the production environment just because the tool is designed to be fast, right? rapid deployment and creation of changes and different, divs and elements and that type of thing. So, that sort of isolation layer, that staging layer, it exists to some extent. Like the line is very, very thin. But if you really think about this, so many WordPress developers, people that develop plugins and those type of things, they will say, hey, you have to have a staging site, staging environment, a dev environment. Mike and I will have a dev website on a completely different server because to heck with that. I'm not even going to try to take down their server or change PHP settings. Like to heck with that. I'm going to do it on an isolated thing. But here's the kicker is that think about all the changes and damage somebody can do in WordPress. They can go in and completely delete the nav bar. They could change the menu to be too long. They might go, oh, I kind of want this menu to have 18 options. They do that. The CSS isn't ready to compensate for that. Now the CSS, the whole menu's off to the frickin', off to the races, like 700,000 meters over to the right. And it's a big mess. And so you're 100% right, Mike. Like there are times where you work in a non-isolated environment. We have a client right now where I'm going to do an upgrade for their site. But they're on an infrastructure so old that it doesn't make sense for me to take the whole infrastructure down, spin it up locally, try to do the thing. Like, I'm just going to try to do the surgery on the site itself, like in production. And it's going to be a little bit risky, but it's going to be the best way to do it because, like, money-wise, time-wise, and its age, it just doesn't make sense to do it the most cautious way. So there are, sort of those edge cases that people get themselves into, whether it's due to time, budget, age of product, whatever, otherwise, where they absolutely are bumping up against production. Like, how many times has our Moodle instance, speaking of Moodle earlier today, how many times has our Moodle instance broken, not because of a development change, but because someone went into the admin panel and just clicked on something to change and it broke the whole damn thing? Let's just say it's happened a lot. So it's absolutely something where even these admin panels that people use that are immensely useful, of course, can totally mess up. And it'll mess up things that the public may see, right? Or the customers may experience. So isolate where you can, but be careful where you can't, I guess is the mantra there. And I have just two more. The last one's just sort of like a cliche send-off, so I'll get into this one. And that is just, and I've said this in the show, I'm sure, before, and that is get stuck and continue. So, let's just say you're given some sort of problem, whatever, and you're trying to solve the problem and you're stumped. You just can't figure it out. Move on and, get the rest of your work done or get as much of the rest of the work done as you can and then come back to the problem whenever you sort of figured it out. An example would be really simply is if you had 5 pages that you were supposed to develop from scratch and you get stuck halfway on the first one. So you're at 0.5 out of 5 at this point. You don't want to hit the deadline. Like, let's say the deadline's a week away. You don't want to hit the deadline having just solved the problem finally. And so now you're at 1 out of 5. Instead, it'd be much better to finish all of them except for that problem, meaning that you're at 4.5 out of 5. So you show off all this work to prove that you did the work, and then you just say, hey, I'm a little bit stuck on this. It's going to take me some time. That 4.5 out of 5 is going to give the client something to chew on, something for them to look at. They probably will even have feedback to change. And then their feedback and changes will end up kind of falling into the other stuff that you do. Your troubleshooting, your whatever, it'll get mixed in. It'll get mixed in with their feedback and you fixing that last 0.5%. So don't just get stumped and get stuck. And I know that's something that, a lot of teachers and schools will teach you as well. Like, don't get stuck on the first question of a test and spend the whole time of the test doing the first question. Like, go and do the other 15 questions. And then if you get 14 out of 15, I mean, that's significantly better than 1 out of 15. The same thing happens here. And the reason why I mention this is that this is difficult. Like, sometimes it's hard to let go of a problem, especially if you're working on it and you're like, I'm so close, but you're just really not. Just walk away from it, come back. And honestly, a bunch of the time when you're working on those other 4 pages, usually you'll think of the solution or it'll give you ideas and they can, kind of pop in every now and then and be like, oh, I wonder if this would work, and kind of give that a try, work on some other things. And having the other 4 pages completed will really give you more confidence. And so you're just like, okay, I'm not an idiot. This is just a problem that I'm having currently. And the final thing here is just a cliche sort of send off, but it is very true. And that is just to get started. So a lot of people, myself included, some people call it procrastination. I call it marveling. Sometimes you marvel at the amount of work that you need to do, and you're just like, holy God, this needs to get started. Like, this is wild. And when you're giving time estimates, the common thing is if you think it's going to take 1 day, quote 3. That still totally exists. But when you sit there and actually do, like, get started and get a bunch of work done, at least in my experience, I'm almost always faster than I think. The reason why projects go 3x as long is usually the human effect. People don't answer, people are doing some back and forth and stuff, and that's totally fine. But you just sitting there and being like, this is going to take me 7 hours, and then you just do it in 4 hours, like, that doesn't always happen, but the real kind of cliche but true thing here is just get started. Don't procrastinate. Don't marvel at the amount of work that you have on your plate. Just get in there and get it done.
This is an important one, and for me is I also get into this habit of, like, when I get too much thrown at me, I kind of freeze. And I think that's a normal response for a lot of people. What helps me the most is knowing that I suck at multitasking. I am an absolutely atrociously bad multitasker. So what my focus is to focus on one task at a time. And that really limits the overwhelming factor for me. So I'll just pick a task out of the plethora that I'm sure that I'm looking at that day, and I'll just get it done. I'll just work on it until I get it done. Other than, like, if you get stuck, like Matt said, I move on to something else and come back to it. That's fine. That's a good piece of advice. I do that a lot. But overall, that's my goal, is, like, one task at a time, knowing your limits, right? Like, if you just have too much on your plate and that's what's freezing you up, then you have to, first of all, be clear with whoever's putting too much on your plate that this is going to limit you. And second of all, just forget about it. Forget about the other stuff. Focus on one thing, one small thing, and the next small thing, and the next small thing. And you're not going to get everything done in one day, but you're going to get a lot more done that way. I can almost guarantee it, especially if you're like me and just suck terribly at multitasking.
Well, I mean, it's a controversial thing sometimes, right? Because some people will actually say that multitasking is impossible, that people can't multitask, you can only do one thing at a time, and whatever. I know it's kind of semantics, but, like, I mean, I have like 8 programs open on my computer right now. I mean, clearly I'm doing some sort of multitasking, and so are you, Mike. Like you said, you had about 15 chat programs open. We should add another one. I still want to do something to you, Mike, where we do an experiment together where, like, you only send it to me on one program and I receive it on that program, but then I only send to you in another program, so you receive another program, and you and I, just us two, use 2 different chat apps to converse with each other.
That would be not a problem. Even with the chat apps we have right now, we don't even have to add any chat apps. We can have like a day-long conversation without ever repeating a chat app. At some point, it's going to get to the point where instead of sending you a chat message, I'll send you a link to a Zoom call.
Oh my God.
In which case, you'll get a link to a Meet call, in which case you'll get a link to a Teams call, etc. It can keep going. Like, we can do that for as long as you'd like. I'm on every single chat app. I think you are too at this point. I think we've both given up. We've both given up the right to only have one chat app because it's just not possible. Like, this is the decision-making process here. You can be stubborn and say, no, I'm only using WhatsApp or Team, whatever, like whatever chat app you decide. The reality of the situation is then you're just not going to talk to 80 to 90% of people that decide to switch chat apps every 5 days. I want to talk to people. I'll use a different chat app every day if I have to. I don't care anymore. I do not give a crap anymore. Send me all your chat apps. I'll use them. If they're spyware, I'll use them. I don't care. I'll send all my information to the spies. I don't care.
I remember back in the day, someone wanted me to use Viber. Is Viber still a thing?
Absolutely a thing. I have a Viber.
Free and secure calls and messages to anyone, anywhere. We can private and secure message, Mike. We can also get business messages. We can do this, dude. This all went for a shit because I held everyone together on BlackBerry Messenger. BBM went multi-platform. I was like, I'm only using BBM. If you want to talk to me, you have to use BBM or text messaging. About 99% of the people I knew went on BBM. And then one day there was a revolution, and I just refused to download apps. And so I just didn't get invited to things. Couldn't get invited to things. No one gave a fuck. So I just opened it up. And then something amazing happened, Mike. And I'm sure you were there for part of this. People started complaining that they had too many chat apps. And I was like, it's almost like we should have all stuck to a single chat app. But instead, we opened up the doors. And now the doors are open. And so now I refuse to use one chat app. To hell with all of yous. I am the captain now.
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly my mentality. I think we both came to the exact same conclusion where I will make their life living hell at this point. If they say I'm tired of chat apps, I will send them a new chat app.
The newest one is chatting on the cursor in Figma for me. Saw that for the first time and was like, what was that? Like, chatting on a cursor, and I'm the old man. I literally like, okay, WinC, How do I chat on the cursor in Figma?
Chat on the cursor. What is this newfangled technology you speak of?
And then I was like, I don't know if the person saw it. I don't know how it works, but I responded, and the rest is history.
Amazing.
But anyway, that concludes this episode. That's my tips and tricks on how to basically get moving and, kind of save some time. If you're a front-end developer specifically, I'm sure some of these tips can be applied to back-end developers as well, full-stack developers, game developers we mentioned even as well. But if you want to support episodes like this going into the future, you can do so by using our Scrimba affiliate link. You can go and check that out. We receive a monetary kickback if you use that. That link will be in our show description. If your podcast app supports it, it'll also be in the show notes on htmlallthethings.com. So you can go check it out there as well. And remember, if you'd like to just straight up become a Patreon, because we love y'all, please join us on Patreon to support the show. That's patreon.com/HTML all the things. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons. Tim from The Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com. Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com. Fire Ant Season via fireantseason.com. Garrett Segal. Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com. Joshua via silvio.us. And Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. I'd also like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. So please go check out his articles on HTMLallthethings.com as well as on that website there. And feel free to leave a comment or review on the platform that you are listening to this on. And this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media. On Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.